State Senator John Kennedy, you're back on the Georgia Vote again. We always appreciate having you on here. You are obviously now in the middle of your campaign for lieutenant governor in the Republican primary in that race. Back to school season's coming up. Education policy has been a big priority of yours, right?
Yes, it has.
Tell me about that.
So for a long time now, I have fought for provisions and laws and policies that are good for Georgia families and good for students, and making sure that we've got a good economic environment, not only for the families, but a good educational environment for the kids. We've got no greater responsibility to our children than make sure they have an opportunity for what I call the Georgia dream and the American dream. And that drove me really to realize something this past year that produced Senate Bill 123, which is we have a hidden threat against our children, and that is the problem with chronic absenteeism. Zach, that's defined as a child missing more than 10%, which is 18 days of the school year. And in looking at this and studying this issue, which nobody seemed to be talking about, and it came on my radar screen because of seeing what was happening in another state and reading about it, is that roughly 21% of our children are missing 10% or more of their school days. That's 360,000 children in our public school system that are missing more than 18 days a year. If they're not in school learning what they need to learn, they're not going to be literate at the literacy levels that we need. They're not going to graduate. They're not going to have that part or a chance at the American dream. And so I wrote, and we passed, and the governor signed Senate Bill 123, which addresses chronic absenteeism. And it calls for a review at the local level, and I think that's very important. We're not trying to push Atlanta solutions all across the state, because the reason for chronic absenteeism may be very different in one area of the state than it could be somewhere else. And so this calls for review teams to look at the problem, try to address solutions, call upon school officials, the school counselor, and school administrators to fashion a solution for chronic absenteeism at the local level.
And this was a bipartisan piece of legislation. I think if I have this right, in the House it passed 160 to 1, and in the Senate it passed unanimously.
Yes.
I think most people from all sorts of different ideological stripes would agree that you want to see kids succeed. But yes. I can imagine a public school educator watching this conversation and thinking, yeah, this is a great policy on paper, but it's another thing to actually bring it into implementation. Public school educators already have so many responsibilities going on at the local level. What do you say to somebody who might argue that this policy is good on paper, but another burden for already really overstretched local educators to carry out, to make it actually happen?
I would encourage someone who has that thought process to first ask the question, how important is it that children attend school? And I think it's going to be hard to come up with something that's more important than that for the educational success of that child. And I think reorienting and getting around the idea of where the real value is, I hope would make someone say, wait a minute, this is, if it's not our priority, it ought to make it be our priority. Second, I would say, as I told the legislators when I presented this bill in the House and the Senate, I'm not offering this as a silver bullet, because there are multiple reasons why a child may be chronically absent. It could be transportation related, it could be family obligations, it could be mental health issues, it could be a lack of a connection with the school system itself. And that's why I didn't just file the bill and pass it. I went an additional step and formed a study committee that's going to be going on this summer. We've got our first meeting in about 2 weeks, in fact. And we're going to study the issue and receive input from folks all across the state as to what are the root causes of chronic absenteeism, study those areas that have addressed it, and listen to people who have successfully resolved it or at least lessened the problem, and hear from some areas that aren't doing so well, so that will inform us on what may be additional legislation to come in 2026 that I may propose.
You mentioned a study committee related to the chronic absenteeism issue. I think this is a good moment to shift gears here. I want to bring up a different committee that is making some news this week. Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who of course is running as a Republican for governor, he recently announced the launch of what he's calling the Committee on Eliminating Georgia's Income Tax. You're on this committee now. Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones has made eliminating the state income tax a cornerstone of his campaign for governor. Do you agree? Do you also want to see the elimination of Georgia's income tax?
I do want to see us continue to reduce, and it would be good if we can eliminate, yes, Georgia's income tax. But I want to make sure that we do it in a smart and responsible way that doesn't just shift the burden somewhere else, or more importantly, not truly reduce the overall tax burden on Georgians. And so I think for that reason, we've got to be smart, we've got to be transparent, we've got to look at what the different possible solutions are. And one of the questions on some people's minds are, well, how do you do that? And the answer is, well, that's why we've got the study committee, is that we'll be looking at responsible ways to reduce and hopefully eliminate the state income tax.
You drill down on, I think, rightly what so many folks' questions would be about this, which boil down to, how do you pay for it? And you're gearing up to get this committee started, but I'm sure you'll be walking in with some thoughts of your own. When you think about ways to reduce the state income tax, and as you put it, eventually move towards eliminating it altogether, what areas are you going to be looking for to make those cuts, to balance it out?
Well, Zach, I don't want to get ahead of the committee or the work of the committee. We've not even met informally or certainly formally. But that's the purpose of the committee work, and to get together and share those ideas. And I think everyone's going to coalesce around, hopefully, the idea of reducing and ultimately eliminating. But again, being thoughtful and making sure that we're not simply pushing the burden somewhere else, so that the net effect is not reducing Georgians' taxes. That's the goal of the committee, as I understand it from other people, a few that I've talked to, and their ideas, we've not even exchanged those ideas yet, but that'll be the work of the committee.
And I don't mean to dwell on this, but I do just want to stay here for one moment longer. Again, knowing you haven't had a formal meeting of the committee yet, just you as an individual legislator, do you have, in your mind, in your view, in your experience, spaces in the state budget where you look at and you think, there's some fat we could cut here?
Sure, and that's the first thing I would say, is there's always ways that we can do things more efficiently and better for the state of Georgia and for Georgians, and doing so being smarter with tax dollars. And I
Specifically, where would that be?
Well, I think that's a general obligation on all of us, but I think one of the areas that we do need to look at, and that is in the areas of tax credits, that there's multiple layers of legislation that get formed over the years. Some items have certain time frames in which they're alive, and have a sunset provision, and some don't. And I think that's going to be one of the things that I want to look at and others are going to look at. You know, one of the things we did not too long ago was try to examine what were the assumptions about certain tax credits that were given for projects, whether they're new projects coming into Georgia, or whether it's an expansion project, or it's some other tax credit being given, and making sure that the assumptions about what we wanted to benefit for the state and what would benefit Georgians actually occurred. I think that's a good beginning point in looking at the value of a tax credit, which ought to be viewed through the lens of what's good for all of Georgians, certainly including and foremost Georgia taxpayers.
Let's talk about something ideological here. You've been in state politics for a long time. You've been in the state much longer than that. I think most observers of Georgia politics would agree that there are two real magnetic poles of power in the Republican Party inside Georgia right now. One is Governor Brian Kemp, the other is President Donald Trump. Both Republicans, but representing sometimes different ideological stripes of that party alignment. When you look at the state party, and when you look at that spectrum, who do you align with more?
You know, Zach, I don't get into, and I think most folks don't want to put tags on people. Some will ask for that, but the problem with doing that is when some people hear one tag, they think of something, and the other person hears the same tag and they think of something differently. I would tell you, I think Governor Kemp has done an incredible job of guiding this state, both through the economic crisis that we had with COVID, ensuring and a recognition that Georgia and Georgia's businesses and family-owned businesses, and the impact that the closure of all of that during that time was incredibly damaging. And he was smart and very forward thinking on how to get us through that.
He was, I hate to interrupt, but I think this is a point worth clarification, because Governor Kemp got a lot of criticism nationwide. Some argued that he reopened the state too soon. Do you agree with his decision to open it when he did?
Absolutely, and I think most people would say that what has happened with our state vindicates the decision that Brian Kemp made early on. Your question about Donald Trump and folks that align or want to put that tag, listen, I'm very happy that Donald Trump is our president. I think if you look at the conservative policies and the success that he's had across our nation, whether it's straightening out our immigration problem, whether it's addressing the inflation problems that we had under the Biden administration, and many others. We're lucky to have his hand on the helm of our country right now, and Brian Kemp, we all should be very grateful for his leadership here in Georgia.
Let's talk about the economy. There are lots of issues in every campaign, but so often voters, at the end of the day, the economy, their pocketbook, their wallet is, if not the number one issue that guides their vote, it's one of the top issues.
Sure.
We hear again and again and again, Georgians are worried about the cost of living. If you're elected lieutenant governor, what are you going to do to make things more affordable?
Number one, we've got to make sure we keep Georgia growing. If we've got a good economic base where folks have an access to and availability to have a good paying job so that they can take care of their family, that alleviates a lot of the anxiety that families face. Number two, we got to make sure we keep Georgia learning. We've already talked about one of my proposals there and making sure that we have kids, we address the absenteeism problem. And third, I want to make sure that we keep Georgia safe. We've got to continue to support our local and state law enforcement. They need to know that they're supported so that the people that we want to run into the breach in the event of a problem, they are who keep us safe. And so it's important that we do that. I think on the economy specifically, I think, fortunately, we have a constitutional requirement for a balanced budget, so we don't have the potential problem like we have in Washington with national spending out of control. But if we've got a pro-business environment and we keep good economic policies so that those jobs continue to be available, that's the best thing that we can do to keep Georgia's economy moving in the right direction at a good pace.
You mentioned immigration and the immigration system under President Joe Biden specifically. Immigration has been a challenge for presidents of both the Republican and the Democratic Party for years. It's become a major focal point in our state, particularly after the tragedy that happened in Athens with the killing of Laken Riley.
Yes.
If you're elected lieutenant governor, what would you do, if anything, legislatively to address the issue of immigration?
Well, let's first state the obvious. Immigration has to be addressed primarily at the federal level. It's the federal laws that guide everything and that put the obligations on our law enforcement to do that which I think most Georgians and most folks in our country expect. But to your point maybe is the immigration issue became, as we said, an issue and a problem for all 50 states. You don't have to have been or have to now be a border state to have an immigration threat because of what we saw with how immigrants came in, illegal immigrants came in. I think what we have to do is continue to try to help in any way we can our federal officials, ICE officials, other law enforcement officials do the job that they're supposed to do, which is for those illegal immigrants that are in this state that need to be returned, need to be dealt with through the court system, whatever that process is called for under the federal laws and the regulations, we need to help. It's not missed on most people seeing on the evening news that there are states and there are cities, whether operating as sanctuary cities or others, where they are actively trying to thwart what ICE is doing to keep Americans safe. That's not acceptable. That's not something hopefully we're going to see in Georgia. And as Lieutenant Governor, I would fight any efforts and support all efforts to support our law enforcement, whether it's in this vein or otherwise.
I'm going to ask you just two last questions. I always want to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
But as we wrap up here on the topic of illegal immigration, there was a lot of campaigning in 2024, particularly from President Trump, about deporting what he often referred to as the worst of the worst, criminals who are in the United States unlawfully. But there are many other people in America right now who are undocumented. They're here unlawfully, but otherwise they're law-abiding citizens. They go to work, they have families, they have lived, some of them, for many years in the United States. How would you propose addressing those undocumented immigrants?
Well, if I were a federal official or elected federal official, I might be in a position to do something about that. But that's, quite frankly, not something that we as state elected officials can do, because you're pointing to, understandably, a distinction and a difference in the laws that apply, and those are all federal laws. None of those stem from state laws. And so, again, we need to encourage our federal officials to be smart, by all means apply and enforce the law. And I think what you're seeing with the Trump administration, as he indicated was the most critical from a time standpoint, is going after those that are truly a threat to our society, those that are criminals from other countries, that come in with, whether it's mental health issues or an absolute long criminal history, that because of the Joe Biden open borders, they flowed in our country without us even knowing what the problem, knowing exactly who they were. So the resources are being devoted to try to get those first. Once that hopefully gets resolved at some point, then it'll be up to our federally elected officials to start determining what's next.
Let's talk about the state Senate as we wrap up here. You're running for lieutenant governor.
Yes.
At least 2 other Republican state senators are also running for lieutenant governor, as well as a Democratic state senator. So that's 4 of you, all in the state Senate,
Yeah.
all running for lieutenant governor, and you've got to still legislate next year in the middle of campaign season. Can you do it?
Sure, we can do it. As you know, and you're alluding to, election years are always interesting, I'll put it that way, down at the Capitol. Do they get complicated? Yes, they get complicated. But I hope to set an example, as I have for 11 years, and certainly the last 3 years of serving as President Pro Tem of the Senate, of making sure that we're there to be respectful and responsible to the people that put us there, to do the job we're there for, which is to hopefully help and aid to pass good legislation that helps Georgians, and also stop bad legislation. That's the approach I'm going to take going into 2026. I invite everyone else, whether it's those that are also running for lieutenant governor or any office, to focus our efforts that way so that we can be responsible and do right by the people that sent us there.
I think that's a good note to end it on. State Senator John Kennedy, thanks very much.
Thank you, Zach.